witches.
Hi, hello, and welcome back to another true crime episode.
Yeah. I did this one, so today we are going to talk about the Santeria murders. Um, so this is about like a cult and Satanism and all kinds of things. Um, but it's a really interesting story and it's very on brand for us. So I say story. This is real. This happened. This is a true crime case. It's not. So when I say story, it's not like a fictional story. But this story is one that almost seemed too unbelievable to be true. There's a drug lord who claims to have supernatural powers, a cult operating just across the Texas border, rumors of blood rituals, human sacrifice, and an iron cauldron said to grant protection from bullets. So interesting. Newspapers and called it a satanic cult. Television specials painted a picture of black magic. And this was decades ago. So even now it circulates as one of the most horrifying, quote, occult crimes in modern history. But how much of what circulates online is actually true? How much was created by fear, sensational headlines, and a misunderstanding of religions that are not their own? So today we're traveling to Matamoros, Mexico in the late 1980s. This was not a good time for Mexico. The rampant cartel violence, political corruption, and superstition all mixed together create this infamous case that we're about to talk about. But before we begin, there is something important to say. Um, this episode discusses crimes committed by a criminal organization led by Adolfo Constanzo. Although members of that group borrowed symbols and practices from Afro-Caribbean religions, including Palomayombe and in media reports, Santeria, those religions themselves do not teach or condone murder or human sacrifice. So I just want to get that out of the way in the very beginning. Even though this crime and this cult reference and appropriated symbols and practices from Afro-Caribbean religions and Santeria, those religions don't actually condone what this cult was doing. Much like suicide cults that practice Christianity or steal things from Christianity, it happens to other religions too. But I wanted to very much touch on that. And especially because when this happened, it was the 80s. Political correctness was not a thing. So when this case hit headlines, a lot of journalists used words like voodoo, witchcraft, and Satanism interchangeably, creating a lot of misconceptions because, as we know and as we have preached many, many times, voodoo is not witchcraft, is not Satanism. Those are not all the same thing. They're all very different religions, and honestly, we're not going to get into that. I was going to say, honestly, most of them are less sacrificey than Christianity, but that's another episode. The goal for this episode is not to reinforce those myths. I want to make it very clear that although this group misused and appropriated things from other religions, that's not what those religions actually think. Throughout this episode, I'm going to pause occasionally for a little segment that we're going to try out called Fact, Folklore, or Media Myth, because there is it's just a chance to kind of look at what investigators actually documented, what local stories added over time, and where pop culture kind of exaggerated the truth of what happened. Because as we've learned over all of our research for our various cases and the witch trials and all of that, um, half the time the actual story is not nearly as sensational as what it grows to be when humans get a hold of it. Um, so here we go. Before we get into talking about Adolfo Costanzo, we're going to jump back a little bit to talk a little bit about the two religions, Palo Mayombe and Santeria, um, because they've been unfairly linked to his crimes. We're going to give them their little time to shine before we actually talk about him. If you've ever watched or a crime documentary or a older podcast about this case, you've probably heard phrases like black magic, voodoo rituals, or narco-satanism. Those are not necessarily wrong, but there's a lot more nuance there.
But they're not right.
Yeah, there's more to it. So we're going to start with Santeria. Santeria developed primarily in Cuba during the colonial period. Enslaved, I say this word wrong every time, Yoruba people, from what is now Nigeria and that region of Africa were forcibly brought across the Atlantic, and they brought their religious traditions with them. Because practicing those beliefs openly could be dangerous, many practitioners identified their deities, known as orishas, with Catholic saints. So very much like a lot of the pagans in European cultures did, they did the same thing where they attributed their deities to the saints to be able to still worship in secret. Over time, those traditions obviously blended, and that created what we know now as Santeria. It's a religion centered on community, ancestors, healing, divination, music, and maintaining balance within the spiritual world. And contrary to decades of media portrayals, it is not a religion of devil worship. And the concept of Satan, as understood in Christianity, is not the same within Santeria. So it's not like that. Honestly, I would love to delve deeper into that religion for a later episode just because I think it's really interesting. But that's just a light overview. And then there's Palo Mayombe. It traces its roots to Central Africa, particularly among Congo-speaking peoples. It evolved again through the experiences of enslaved peoples from Africa and the Caribbean, preserving their traditions while adapting to their new realities. One of the most recognizable ritual objects is the nanga, which is sometimes called a cauldron or a sacred vessel. To someone unfamiliar with the religion, it can appear unsettling because it might contain earth, sticks, stones, bones, iron objects, symbolic materials, representing the natural and spiritual worlds. So if you were to just see it and not understand, it might seem a little spooky. But within authentic practice, the Nanga is understood as a sacred object used in ceremonies, guidance, and spiritual work. I obviously can't speak to how they source the various items, but I would imagine that it is humane, and they're not like sacrificing animals in their cauldrons. I didn't get that deep into it. Again, I would love to do a deeper dive in another episode, but unfortunately, talking about it in this one would just make the episode way too long. Unfortunately, after the Matamoros murders, photographs of one particular Nanga became one of the most widely published images associated with the case because the images were shocking. They also led people to believe that, or to assume that every practitioner of Palo Mayombe engaged in horrific acts, which obviously is no more accurate than assuming that every member of Christianity is outside of Planned Parenthood protesting. You can't apply a generalization to an entire group of people. So this is where today's story kind of is going to start. Adolfo Constanzo didn't simply practice these traditions. He selectively borrowed beliefs, symbols, and ritual language from multiple spiritual systems and fused them with his own desire for control, fear, and criminal power, much like other cult leaders. And much like other cult leaders, associates described him as charismatic, intelligent, and remarkably persuasive. He convinced his followers that he could predict danger, that they could do rituals to make them invincible or invisible to law enforcement, that spirits could shield them from bullets. People like historians and investigators still debate, historians like it was ages ago, but it kind of was, debate whether or not his followers truly believed those claims or just found them useful to cope with the world, which is kind of what all religion is, but whatever. But now, fact, folklore, or media myth. Fact. Oh, I shouldn't say that yet. I'm going to say one and I want you to guess. Okay. The label narco-satanism became enormously popular in newspapers and television reports. While it made for sensational headlines, scholars have noted that the term overly simplified a complex situation, blending together multiple religious traditions with the actions of one violent criminal group. As a result, many peaceful practitioners of Afro-Caribbean religions face misunderstanding and stigma.
Truth.
Yeah, that's a media myth. The narco-satanism was the media myth.
Oh.
But that actually happened. So folklore stories quickly spread that Costanzo possessed supernatural powers, that bullets physically could not strike him, that police dogs refused to enter his ritual sites, and that spirits warned him before raids, becoming part of his legend. So those are some folklore surrounding him. And then the fact is investigators documented ritual objects recovered from locations connected to Costanzo's criminal organization. Court records and contemporary reporting describe evidence that religious symbolism played a role in the group's activities. So, like, yes, those ritual objects were found there, but then folklore and media myth took it way too far. But by the late 1970s, Adolfo Constanzo was already developing a reputation that extended far beyond spiritual circles. He wasn't just reading fortunes and performing rituals. He was building something big. Clients came to him looking for protection. They came looking for luck. Criminals came looking for luck. And before long, some of the most powerful traffickers operating in the U.S.-Mexico border would come looking for something that they believed only one man could provide: invincibility. Now we meet Adolfo Constanzo himself and explore how an ambitious young con man comes into one of the most feared figures in modern true crime. By the time he became a household name in Mexico and the United States, he'd already spent years crafting his image. He was born in Miami in 1962 to a Cuban family. His parents separated, and he spent time in both the United States and Mexico, growing up in environments where multiple religions, traditions, and folk spiritual practices existed together. According to later reporting, he was introduced to Afro-Caribbean spiritual practices at a young age, though if there was formal training or anything like that, it's debated. What is not debated is his charisma, which I feel like is the case in so many true crime cases.
Oh yeah,
Ted Bundy, the Mansons, everybody is just so charismatic, and everybody's like, "What? No way."
Well, that's how it's easy for you to get away with things.
Yeah. So those who knew him described him as articulate, confident, and unusually perceptive. He seemed to understand what people wanted to hear. Um, and he would promise them what they wanted to hear. Um, he developed a reputation as a spiritual advisor. Um, and he even had like business owners coming to him, politicians, members of organized crime. Um, the Whether every story about who was a client of his is true is difficult to verify just because of the nature of a cult and his um, particular clients. But his reputation grew through word of mouth, and he definitely had cultivated relationships with members of drug trafficking organizations, and that was like confirmed. So as his um, circle grew, he was no longer simply performing ceremonies. He became a trusted advisor for some of these people. He would like foresee danger, identify traitors, provide supernatural protection from rivals or law enforcement. Um, and that just made his clientele grow even more and him become even more dangerous. According to court testimony and investigative accounts, rituals became intertwined with the group's identity. Participants reportedly came to believe that following Costanzo's instructions would keep them safe and strengthen their loyalty to one another. Which is classic grooming, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also there's an element of fear here, and he is giving them safety from whatever other that they fear, which very much helps that loyalty. Okay, fact, folklore, or myth, media myth. The fact for this point is multiple investigations and court proceedings established that Costanzo served as a spiritual advisor to members of criminal organizations and exercised significant influence over his followers. That is the factual thing that we have. However, the folklore, stories circulated that he could become invisible, stop bullets, or communicate directly with spirits who warned him of police activity. These claims became part of his legend, but have never been substantiated by evidence. And the media myth that arose out of that fact was that popular accounts often portray everyone around him as unquestioning believers. In reality, available testimony suggests a far more complicated picture involving fear, coercion, personal ambition, and criminal loyalty alongside spiritual belief. In the spring of 1989, one disappearance will trigger an internal investigation that brings his organization to the spotlight. The investigation that exposed his organization, his cult, didn't begin with detectives searching for a cult leader. It began with a missing college student. In March 1989, 21-year-old Mark Kilroy, a pre-med student from Texas, traveled with friends to Matamoros during spring break. Like thousands of other students crossing the border each year, they expected a weekend of celebration and then a return home. Kilroy did not return home. Concern quickly turned into an international search involving authorities on both sides of the border. At first, investigators considered possibilities that were, unfortunately, common for the region at the time: an accident, a robbery, or a kidnapping connected to organized crime. As they interviewed the witnesses and followed leads, evidence gradually pointed towards a ranch outside the city that appeared connected to members of a trafficking organization. And again, this is drug trafficking, not human trafficking at this point. What officers encountered there would become one of the most widely reported crime scenes of the decade. The discovery shocked the investigators and the public alike, and it immediately generated worldwide headlines. Reporters focusing on ritual objects found at the property, and using phrases like cult killings, black magic, and narco-satanism. The television coverage emphasized the most visually striking details while offering little explanation of the religious traditions that were appropriated in those items. As the story spread, viewers, so like just the common people reading these or consuming this media, came away believing that the religious objects, like it was religious crime and that these were like religious sacrifices. But that was maybe not quite the case. Investigators were more focused on a more practical question: who organized this group and where did that leader go? Evidence gathered during the investigation pointed increasingly toward Adolfo Constanzo and several close associates who fled before authorities arrived, and an international manhunt follows. So I feel like in most pop culture, like movies and shit about cults, when the police are onto them, they like start burning everything and killing everyone. That did not happen in this case. There was plenty of evidence left behind, and they were looking for Adolfo because of this. Law enforcement agencies in Mexico and United States worked together to identify members of the organization and trace Costanzo's movements. But the challenge here was not only locating a fugitive, but separating the facts from all of the rumors that started to come out. Because in this kind of a high-profile case with occult-like things involved, especially in the 80s, which was around the time of Satanic Panic, like this was huge and it was hard. Like there was so much false reporting to tip lines and rumors and all kinds of things happening. Like people were insisting that he crossed the border disguised as a priest. Some people believed that he had already died. So the investigators had a lot to deal with here.
That's for sure.
Yeah. But the search was closing in. They were closing in. They had information and like interviews that were allowing them to close in on him. They did finally locate his final hideout in Mexico City, setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation that would cement his place in true crime history. Yeah. So here's we're gonna talk about the final manhunt. By April of 1989, investigators on both sides of the border had pieced together enough evidence to identify Adolfo Constanzo as the central figure. And the discovery at the ranch turned this into the manhunt that we're discussing now. As arrests were being made, because they started to find members of the group and arresting them, they started to learn more about the group's structure and, more importantly, about Costanzo, his leadership, and the extraordinary influence he had over the people around him. One detail appeared repeatedly, and that's that followers didn't simply obey him because he claimed spiritual authority. Many thought that questioning him would bring catastrophic consequences. Like they were afraid of him. Whether that fear came from genuine belief, intimidation, years of psychological manipulation, a little bit of all three, it's hard to tell. But experts who study coercive groups often point to the same pattern: isolation, absolute loyalty, and the gradual replacement of independent judgment with unquestioning obedience. And that's exactly what happened here. The supernatural image he cultivated wasn't just part of his identity, it was a tool to control others. If the followers believed he could see the future, then that was like another way to control them, because whatever he said would be what they did, kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the investigators closed in, Costanzo and several loyal followers fled to Mexico City, moving between various safe houses, but the search ended on May 6th, 1989. Police surrounded a small apartment after receiving information that fugitives connected to the case were hiding inside. What followed was brief but chaotic. Sorry, had to take a drink. I was at a concert yesterday and my throat was scratchy. Okay. Rather than surrender, Costanzo directed one of his closest followers to shoot him before taking his own life. By the time officers entered the apartment, both men were dead. This confrontation marked the end of the manhunt, but not the end of the questions. And also, what a little bitch. Like, I can't kill myself, so you kill me. Like, really? Okay, anyway. Investigators recovered in this apartment notebooks, ritual objects, and other evidence that helped reconstruct the group's activities. Associates were arrested, faced prosecution, and they were able to provide testimony that filled a lot of the gaps that the investigators couldn't figure out. Even then, though, every mystery was not resolved. There are some stories surrounding the case that are impossible to verify even today. And many of those have been repeated so often online and in the media that they've just become accepted as fact. Which brings us to our last fact, folklore or media myth. The fact being, Adolfo Constanzo died during the police operation in Mexico City on May 6, 1989, after instructing a follower to kill him rather than allow him to be captured alive. Again, little bitch. Could have killed himself, but had to have somebody else do it. Contemporary investigative records and court proceedings establish the broad outline of these events. That's the fact. Folklore surrounding that fact. Some stories claim Costanzo escaped and lived under another identity, that his spirit continued to guide his followers after his death. And these tales persist in books, documentaries, and online forums, but no credible evidence supports them. Also, his body was recovered. So, like, he definitely died. The rest of it I can't help you with, but he definitely died. Media myth about this fact. Popular retellings often portray Costanzo as an all-powerful occult mastermind with supernatural abilities. The historical record paints a different picture, a charismatic criminal who combined manipulation, fear, ritual symbolism, and organized crime to control those around him. Sometimes reality does not need embellishment. Sometimes the truth is unsettling enough. If you listened to this episode from beginning to end and you saw the title of Santeria Murders, you're probably a little confused because we didn't really talk a lot about magic or the specific rituals that were involved because that's intentional. In spite of the sensational headlines and like all of the rumors surrounding this story, it was never really about supernatural power. It was about belief. Belief is one of the most powerful forces in human history, and people have crossed literal oceans because of it. They've built civilizations because of it. They've started wars because of it. And in rare, tragic cases, charismatic individuals have twisted belief into a weapon. Adolfo Constanzo did not invent that pattern. History is full of leaders who have convinced others that they possess special knowledge, divine favor, or extraordinary abilities. What made this case unique was that it unfolded during the height of the international drug trade under the glare of 24-hour news coverage at a moment when audiences were primed to believe stories about secret cults and hidden satanic conspiracies. It is impossible to separate this case from the broader cultural atmosphere of the late 1980s, the era of satanic panic. In many communities, accusation of ritual abuse or secret satanic groups gained traction despite little or no supporting evidence. So against that backdrop, the Matamoros investigation became more than a criminal case. It became a symbol. And that's why this episode has kind of been shaped the way that it has, because unfortunately that symbolism came at a cost. For many practitioners of Santeria and Palomayambe, the following years after the case brought increased suspicion, discrimination, and misunderstanding, much like 9/11 bringing suspicion and misunderstanding and hatred of Middle Eastern people. It didn't have anything to do with them truly. Religious leaders repeatedly explained that Costanzo had distorted their traditions for his own purposes, and that this was not truly what their religion was. However, the truth does not necessarily sell newspapers. So these voices did not receive the same attention as the sensational headlines. And maybe that's one of the lasting lessons here. It's easier to believe a story about a supernatural evil than to accept a more uncomfortable truth that ordinary people can be manipulated by charisma, certainty, and the promise of power. Yet, the folklore around this case remains fascinating. If you dive deeper into it, there are a lot of really interesting stories surrounding this, but you have to look at them through the lens of knowing that they stole traditions and distorted them from other religions, and that is not actually how those religions use those traditions. But yeah, so there's so much more to these cases. Like, there's a lot more detail we could have gone into, but that's the biggest part of it, is that how they were caught in the end. I'm sure that there is more that even the investigators don't know, that like probably other murders and things that were connected to this cult, but that was the biggest one that led to his downfall.
Cults are fascinating. Not that, like, I want to be a part of one. Like,
No, but the psychology behind them is
yeah, like,
really
I don't want to say,
interesting.
like, I like cults because that gives off the wrong idea. But the idea of cults is fascinating,
Okay.
and that is what I enjoy.
So now I have to say something else. So I've been telling you about the author that I'm currently obsessed with, Rachel Harrison, who writes feminist horror. She has a book that I recently finished called Black Sheep, and it is about a girl who grew up in a cult. And so now I think we should start with that one. So,
Yes.
but anyway, that is the
Like a true
Santeria
story?
Murders. No,
Oh, okay.
no,
I was like, oh my God, is it a true story about somebody who grew up in murder? Or
no,
not in
no, no,
murder, but in a cult?
no. But it is
Cool.
a really good book.
Yeah. All right. Cool.
So, all right.
Well, that's it for True Crime, the Santeria Murders. So until next time.
Bye.